In this lesson, we're going to see and learn more about some common vocabularies that you will be hearing quite a lot throughout this course. So I want you guys to just get to know them before we jump into how they work in After Effects. So there will be even more vocabularies coming on, but these are the most important ones. And when you know what these are and how they work, understanding the rest will be a lot more easier. So we're going to start with the most important thing that contributes to motion, to animation, stop motion, or just any type of motion in general, and that is called a keyframe. So keyframes indicate the start/end point of an action in After Effects. This is also the same thing for other softwares such as Premiere Pro. And to create motion with layers, the stopwatch, this is right here, needs to be turned on for the keyframes to appear. Now what that means is that if these guys are not blue, by the way, blue means it's turned on and that thing is active. So if this is turned on, my keyframes will appear. If this is gray, they will not appear. There will be nothing in my timeline. Now, so the keyframe, we said it indicates the start and end point of an action. So when we look at our image example here, we have 3 actions happening. We have a position action. We'll learn more about what those are soon. We have a position action, a scaling action, and a rotation action. And we can see we have like sets of keyframes. And by the way, each of these rows are separate and they're not related to one another, as in if you make a point here, it's not going to intervene with the one down below. But you can see here at the position, this is the start point of a position, and that's the end. So when you have a position animation, it means that your layer, let's say this is my layer, it's going to move to any direction that I tell it to until it reaches the end point. So that's what's happening here. We have 2 keyframes on the position line, which means that at this point, my layer is moving and here it stops. And again, here it could move to another direction. It stops here, moves to another direction, stops here, and it just keeps on going until it reaches the end of the timeline. And this is also the most common keyframe. This is the shape. It's called a linear keyframes. There are other types. We'll learn more about that in a minute. But you can see this shape is the same. But essentially, when you make keyframes for each of these rows, you are moving a subject in your timeline. So when all of these guys get combined, you have a really nice animation of your layer. So if you just know that whatever movement you want to do, there needs to be keyframes in your layers. Alright, now that we know what the keyframes are, let's look at the types of keyframes. So there are 5 types of keyframes, as you can see on the screen. And I called it ease because when you change the common keyframe, which is a linear one, we just talked about it. When you turn this to any one of these guys, you're easing that keyframe. So this is just a regular one. Once I ease it, it will turn into some of these guys. Now these are the 5 main keyframes. There are other types too, and we'll learn those in the tutorials. But for now, let's get to know these 5. So there are 5 different keyframes, and each is used for a certain type of motion. By using these in our workflow, we can ensure a smooth animation or transition. When we use any of these types, we're easing the linear keyframe, and this is the linear keyframe. So as soon as you turn on the stopwatch of that transform option, this guy will appear. If you go on this guy and you hit the key or you right click to change the keyframe type, you are easing that linear keyframe. When we mention that these are used for certain types of motion, let me quickly explain what that means. So we saw that we can maybe change the position of our layer. Let's say first it's here, then it ends up here. Other times we're doing a curve. So first my ball is here and then I'm going to move it here to create a curve with it. Other times I'm maybe scaling it in or out, like it's a tiny ball here and then it becomes larger. Depending on the type of motion, I just described 3. We will choose these guys to help the motion be more smooth, so the animation to be a lot more smoother. For example, if I have a curve motion here and my ball is going along that curve, I do not want my ball to be like, going in zigzag motions, or for it to stop halfway or maybe slow down at some point unless I choose that to happen. So using these keyframes, I can ask After Effects to go over my motion and kind of choose the right timing. So by the end of my composition, I have a really smooth motion of my ball going along this curve. So that's when we ease that motion. Let's look at something else. All right, so we talked about the different types of motion. These are the 5 different types of motion that is available for every layer within After Effects. So it doesn't matter if it's a text, if it's a image, if it's a video, if it's a PNG, as in a shape without a background. So it has a transparent background. No matter what layer you have, you will have these options in the Transform tab. So they're usually referred to as APSRT, which is A for anchor point, P for position, S for scale, R for rotation, and T for opacity. Now let me quickly explain what these are. So the anchor point is the main anchor at which other animations occur. For example, I have a circle right here, and this is my anchor point. It's right in the center. So when I rotate this circle, nothing's going to happen much because it's standing still and the rotation is just happening around that circle. But if my circle was here and my anchor point was here, and I rotate my circle is going to move around this anchor point. So think of it as like maybe the planets. If this is like Earth and this is the moon, the Earth is the anchor point, the moon will move around it. So the anchor point, just think of it as you have a ship and you just want to place your anchor. We'll get into each of these in a more detailed way in the future lessons. And then we have position. Position is when you change the location of your layer. So maybe first you want it to be in the corner, then you want it to be over here. So using the position transform option, you get to move that away using the keyframes that we talked about. Scale is when you change the size of that layer. You can make it big or small, and you can even make it bigger than your screen, or even as small as a few pixels. So that's why you use the scale. You can see that scale is in %. Anchor point and position have the X and Y values. So X is here, Y is here, X, Y. But scale is in %, which is related to the size of your layer. And when you link them, they will be equal no matter what. This is also the X and Y values, but it's in %. And then we have rotation, which we talked about here. It's a turning point of your layer. So if you wanted to rotate at an angle, you can see that this is an angle. You get to add maybe plus 90 degrees, plus 3 degrees. You can even go for negative 3 degrees, anything you want. And we also have a number here, so maybe if it's 2 times 90 degrees, so it's going to travel twice with a 90-degree angle. And these are blue, which means you get to add a keyframe, and this is what a stopwatch that is not turned on looks like. You can see it's gray, but when it turns on, it's going to turn blue, this color blue. So if I want to add a scale animation, I will turn this on and then I'll move in a few frames and then change the amount of scaling that I want. So anchor point, position, scale, rotation, and opacity are the transform options that each layer in After Effects has. Using these 5, you can move and animate layers. And I forgot to mention opacity. Opacity is the amount of visibility of that layer. So if it's at 0%, there is nothing. Nothing is visible. That particular layer is invisible. If it's at 100%, that layer is fully visible. If it's at like 50, it's kind of faded. So that's what you do with the opacity. Well, let's look at something else. Right, the next thing is FPS. When you're working with any type of motion, whether you're a photographer, you're dealing with videos, maybe you're editing them, FPS should be pretty familiar to you guys, but if not, I'm going to explain it. So FPS stands for frames per second. The more frames per second, the higher the quality of the footage. The number of FPS determines the number of still images it takes to make a full second of motion. And we have an example down here. So 30 FPS means 30 still frames. And when you're making a composition in After Effects, you have the option to change your FPS. You can see here it's 29.97. We've opened up this guy, so it goes from 8 to 120. So 120 is like really high quality, 8 is low quality. The most common one would be 30 FPS. By default, you would either be on 29.97 or 30. They're almost the same. But basically, if you want to make a really high quality footage, you would increase the FPS, which would also come with a lot of frames for you to work with. And what that means is that if you're doing, for example, a frame by frame animation, which means that you will be drawing in each of the single frames of that, let's say 5-minute animation. If we have a 30 FPS, that means to make 1 second of the finished product, you need to draw, let's say, a fish 30 times. If it's at 120 FPS, you need to draw that fish 120 times for 1 second of video. So FPS is really important. And now that you know what it is, you get to choose the right number for your video. And yeah, so now let's move on to the final vocabulary that we have in this lesson, and that is the gizmo. So the gizmo is a transform tool that is used to move 3D shapes and layers. You can use this tool to scale, position, and rotate 3D layers with one tool. Each of these colors stand for different axes. So red for the x-axis, so over here it's kind of pink. Green for the y-axis, and blue for the z-axis. So if you look at this, you can see all of the 3 colors. First we have a gray circle, and on that we have the different colors that indicate each of the axes that we talked about. So we have this gray circle, and on it we have the colors like we just said. And if you know geometry, I'm sure you all know, when you come and deal with 3D shapes, instead of x and y values, you have x, y, and z values. So it's the same logic here. We're using these 3 axes and this transform tool to move our shape and layers within After Effects. So we will be using these 3 to move your 3D layer around. And let's look at the shape here. And this is going to be overlapping your shape, so it's going to be placed on top. So don't think that it's a part of your layer. It's just a tool that you can use for movement. So the thing in the middle is the center of that layer. And then we have these 3 guys. And basically, this means that you're scaling it in along the y-axis, because blue was for the z-axis. And if you move it along this red guy, you're scaling it in or out along the x-axis. Then we have this curved shapes, and basically the curves relate to the rotation of those axes. So if this is our shape, I move it this way, I'm rotating it along the z-axis. Same applies for the blue guy and the red guy, or it's the pink guy. So this is what a gizmo is. Also, when you're working with Puppet pin tools, you will also get a gizmo. Although it will not be shaped this way, it will just be a circle, which in this case it's grayed out, so it'll be just a circle and a tiny square in the edge. And basically a gizmo is a transform tool. Just keep that in mind as we progress with the lesson. So these were just some of the vocabularies that you guys will be hearing a lot as we continue with this course. So it's really helpful to know what they are and what they're used for. So in the future lessons, you won't be confused and wondering what the terms are, because I will be using them quite often. And this is to avoid the confusion for the future. But if this lesson was a bit confusing and you still don't know what these guys are for, don't worry about it. As we move in with the lessons, I'm going to show them to you in After Effects as a visual representation. But I just want you guys to know the words that you're going to hear from now on. And yeah, now that we know what these words are and what their meanings are, we can now start learning about After Effects. And we're going to start to see how things work in After Effects, go over each of the tools, and just some basic stuff that you should know before you start with the actual practices that you will do in After Effects. So I hope you guys enjoyed this lesson, and let's get started with the lessons.